Okay, welcome to our first set of biology notes. These notes will be on the plant cell. This is my first set of notes, so please bear with me. I probably make a lot of mistakes, but we're good. Okay, so an overview, some things that we're going to talk about in case you want to do the outline part of taking notes. The first thing we're going to do is talk about the cell theory. Then we'll talk about why cells need to be small, or cell size. And then finally we'll get to cell structures and their functions. Okay, so let's start with the cell theory. The cell theory is an important part of biology because it tells us all of the things that we need to know to unify all of living things. And one of those things is that all living things are made up of cells. So whether that's an animal, a plant, a fungus, or a single-celled bacteria, every living thing has at least one cell to be considered alive. So some debates that this causes is over viruses, because viruses technically do not have cells. They only have DNA surrounded by protein. So some scientists believe that these are living organisms, and some scientists believe that they're not. Another thing that we know about biology, and of course then plants, is that cells can only come from other cells. And this is actually like cells. So plant cells don't give rise to animal cells. A long time ago they used to think that mice would be born from the grain, because they'd open up their grain sheds and all of these mice would come out of the grain. But now we know that that's not true. So cells only come from other cells. Plant cells make other plant cells. And then the last part of the cell theory is that nothing smaller than a cell is considered alive. So the actual cell parts that we'll talk about in a few minutes are not considered living, but the actual cell is. So when we take all of those parts and put it together inside of a cell membrane, then we get a working organism, or a living organism. Okay, so that means that DNA is not considered alive, or the nucleus is not considered alive, or even smaller like protons and elements and things like that would not be alive, but a cell would be. So bacteria and plants and fungus and protists and animals. Okay, so then our next topic is cell size. Most of you already know that you can't look at yourself or look at a plant and see the cells. That's because they're super small or microscopic. Okay, this pumpkin is really large, and it's made up of cells. These pumpkins are small and also made up of cells. And no, that's not my little girl, but she is cute. Okay, so the point is that the larger pumpkin is made up of the same size cells as the smaller pumpkin. The only difference is that the larger pumpkin, since it's larger, has more cells. So another example would be a mouse has the same size cells as an elephant. Which one has more? Of course, the elephant. Okay, one of the reasons why cells need to be small is because it's more efficient for them to be small. As a cell needs to move substances like water, sugars, proteins, waste products in and out, the smaller area, the smaller space, the easier it is to move things. So think about moving things from your room to your kitchen versus moving things from your room all the way outside down your driveway and into somebody else's house. So the smaller the space that you have to move, the quicker you can do that. Another reason is to prevent DNA overload. DNA is the control of the cell. It gives the instructions for the cell. So if there's too much cell, too much stuff, too big of a cell, then the DNA gets overloaded and it just can't give out instructions to all of the cell. And it just kind of freaks out and crashes. Okay. And then the last part for cell size, it gets back to that efficiency, but we need to talk about surface area. Okay. There's 3 times the surface area, or the outsides, of a large cell, or excuse me, of a small cell when we break it down, than of a large cell. So in this large cell, we have this outside and this outside and this. Okay, there's 6 sides to this cube. So we only have so much outsides, and we have a whole lot of insides. But if we take the same amount here and we break it up into smaller pieces, now we've got lots of outsides because this cube has 6 outsides and this one and this one, and the amount of volume or the inside is a lot smaller. So this would kind of be like taking a piece of steak and cooking a big piece of steak and trying to get it completely well done versus cutting that same piece of steak into little pieces. It's going to cook a lot quicker because the materials or the heat in that case can move through a lot quicker. So for cells, the materials can move through these cells, because they're smaller, a lot more efficiently and a lot quicker than if the cells were this size. Okay, so hopefully you're ready for some more. If not, maybe pause for a second. This is the dragon fruit. I don't know if you've ever had one, but they're pretty sweet and tasty. Okay, now we're going to get ready for the cell structures. Okay, the first thing that we need to talk about with cell structures is that we're talking about eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells can look something like that, and the main part of a eukaryotic cell is that it has this structure called a nucleus. So eukaryotic means to have a nucleus. That includes the animals, the plants, the fungus, and the protists, but not the bacteria. The word nucleus comes, and eukaryotic comes from the Greek words eu, which mean true, and karyon, which mean nut. When they first saw these under the microscope, they thought there were little nuts inside of the cell, so that's where that comes from. Okay, let's get to the plant structures. Okay, so inside the plant cell or an animal cell or a protist cell, there are lots of little structures. We're going to specifically talk about what's inside of a plant. As you can see, there's a lot of structures listed here, but we won't go over all of them. Okay, the idea of having these little structures inside to help the cell function, those are called organelles, or little organs. Just like in our bodies, we have organs that help us to live. A cell has little organelles that help it to live, and they each have their own specific functions. So let's talk about some of the plant cell ones. Okay, this one right here, as we said before, is the nucleus. The main function of the nucleus is to store DNA for the cell. The DNA is the instructions that the cell needs to do everything that it needs to do. Make proteins, make lipids, carbohydrates, fats, whatever it needs to make, it's coded in the DNA. Okay, this structure here is also very important in plant cells, and you're only going to find these in plant cells. They're called central vacuoles, and they're big bubbles. A vacuole is a big bubble, and it stores water, minerals, and other substances for the cell, sometimes extra sugars and things like that. And what this does is it actually pushes against the cell membrane, which is right here, which we'll talk about later, when this is full, and it helps the plant cells to stay rigid or firm. Okay. Without a central vacuole, plant cells wouldn't have enough water, and they would wilt and could die. Okay. The next organelle is the chloroplast. The chloroplasts are bean-like structures. Sometimes they're represented as circles, but they're more of this oblong shape. And they're green, and these are used by the plant and some bacteria to make sugars using sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water. Okay. We'll talk a little bit more about how this structure works and the insides of it and everything when we get to photosynthesis. But basically, chloroplasts are like solar panels. They take in light and they convert it into energy or sugar for the plant. And this structure is just the opposite of that nice little chloroplast. This is called a mitochondria. Mitochondria job is to turn sugar into usable energy. So an important part here is that plants can make their own food, and a lot of people know that. They use these chloroplasts, they make their own sugars. That's great. But a plant needs mitochondria, just like we have mitochondria, to turn that sugar into usable energy. If plants only had chloroplasts and mitochondria, that would be like you going in your kitchen, making all the food in your kitchen and just leaving it on the table. It doesn't do your body any good unless you can convert it or use it and eat it. So plants make sugars using the chloroplasts, and then they use those sugars and burn them and turn them into energy using the mitochondria. Okay. If you have any questions, I encourage you to pause the video now and write down any questions you might be having. This particular little organism here is called a pineberry. It is a relative of the strawberry. Okay, so a few more organelles that we need to talk about. This here is a ribosome. In many pictures of cells, it's pictured as a little round ball, but they actually have more of this kind of weird shape to them. And ribosomes have one main function, and that is to make or assemble proteins. We'll talk a little bit more later how the DNA turns into RNA, and the RNA goes to one of these little ribosomes and it codes for all of our protein. But right now, all that you need to know is that the ribosome's job is to assemble or make proteins. Before we go on to the next one, I just want to make a quick little note that ribosomes, I tend to remember that they make protein because ribs are protein, and they have that same sort of sound to it. Okay, this little guy is the Golgi apparatus, or Golgi bodies, or sometimes Golgi complex. Nobody knows what to call them, but Golgi is the main thing. The Golgi bodies sort, package, and transport proteins. They're sometimes compared to a post office because, like a post office, they package up everything for us and get everything ready to go. So these little bubbles here, these little vesicles that are coming off of the Golgi, that would be where it's packaged and getting ready to send something out. Okay? And then our final organelle here is the endoplasmic reticulum, also called the ER for short. There's two different kinds, smooth that does not have ribosomes on it, and rough. Okay. They both kind of surround the nucleus. That's usually where you will find them. Their main job is to make the membranes, like make the nuclear membrane, make the cell membrane, make the membranes of these organelles and others, and then they also make carbohydrates and lipids, which are also known as fat. And sometimes they do a little transport too. Okay, finally we have our other structures of the cell that really can't be called organelles but are just as important. The first one here is the cell membrane. Now this is going to be found in both plant cells and animal cells and bacteria also and fungus, but the main function of this is to provide a boundary for the cell. It's semi-permeable, which means it lets some things in and keeps other things out. So there's these little protein channels. They're little areas where things can flow through, or sometimes they can slip through these little cracks right here in between the heads or phospholipids of the cell membrane. We call the cell membrane a phospholipid bilayer because here's one layer and here's the other layer, and these little tails always face in towards each other. These heads here, these little circles, do not or they like water, and so then these little tails face away from the water. So that's how we'll know there's water on the inside of the cell and also on the outside of the cell. These little markers here real quick, these are protein markers, and this kind of identifies a cell as the type of cell it is. So you have these, and these would identify a cell as being your cell. Okay, then we get the cytoplasm. I don't have a picture for that because it's just the jelly-like substance that holds all of the cell structures. So it's a very watery, probably about 70% water, and it just holds all of the organelles inside of that cell membrane. And then finally, plants have one more structure that we are not going to see in animals, and that is the cell wall. Okay, this surrounds the cell membrane, and it gives support for the cell. And a little bit of protection, but mainly support. You can see by this diagram here, this micrograph, that they're almost square or a lattice work structure, and they're very strong and rigid. They also contain a substance called cellulose, which is a complex carbohydrate that helps give the cell walls its strength and give plants its strength. Another way to look at that is if you look at celery. Celery has a lot of cellulose in it. Thank you for listening to these notes and hopefully writing them down. It's time to get some work done and practice with these concepts that we learned. But before we do, I just want to tell you about this little guy. It's called the Indian pipe plant. It is a completely parasitic plant, has no chlorophyll at all, and we only see it when it flowers like this. Have a great day. Thank you.